Today, I'm going to finish up talking about material living standards and then go on and discuss fertility in the pre-industrial world. And just to recap, in looking at material living standards, we've looked at income measures and then partial income measures such as the wheat wage. We've looked at calorie and protein consumption in different societies. And we've then gone on to discuss heights. And for heights, we have two sorts of information. We have the heights of the living and the heights of the dead through skeletons. And when we look at the heights of the living, we see it confirms two facts, or it seems to confirm two facts. One is that Western Europe is a relatively rich part of the world in 1800, and that Asia, for some reason, is a very poor part of the world, South Asia and East Asia. And secondly, again looking at heights of the living, that the average hunter-gatherer is about as tall as a Western European in 1800, that is modern hunter-gatherers, and consequently hunter-gatherers are probably taller than people in Asia. Okay? And the important caveat, though, about this is it's assuming that everyone has the same, every group has the same genetic potential in terms of height. And as I say, there are some data in the modern world, such as the heights of modern Japanese, that suggest that that might be a slightly dangerous assumption. The next thing we were going to look at then was the heights of dead people gained through skeletal evidence. And that allows us to actually look at actual pre-industrial Stone Age hunter-gatherers and say, how did their living standards seem to compare to the world around about 1800? And again, an important caveat there is that skeletal survival is not random. And if it's correlated with the robustness of the skeletons, then there may be a bias in favor of finding greater heights in the past. And that non-random survival shows up in terms of there are too few skeletons of children that are found from the Stone Age to show that that would be a representative sample of all skeletons. And so, and in looking at that, it's always good, it's hard to keep a kind of reference. So the important thing to think about is that England, around about 1800, heights on average in the population are somewhere in this range of 166 to 171 centimeters. And that's about 65 to 67 inches. And remember, the convenient fact is that I'm 60 or was 67 inches. And so you can see that this is the upper end of the British average, around about 1800. When we look then at the skeletal evidence, the first thing that shows up is that within Europe, Stone Age people in Europe in the Mesolithic and Neolithic show as having heights that are just as tall as Western Europeans around about 1800. And we can do direct comparisons then because we can go to the cemeteries around about 1800 and say, well, what are the measured heights of people in the cemeteries? And so that's a direct comparison, and it suggests that there's just no trend over this period. So these rich Europeans in 1800 don't seem to be any more robust or have any better health or nutrition than Stone Age people in Europe. We can get similar evidence for Japan. And remember, the important thing was that the Japanese are extremely small when they're first measured in the 1880s. And it was 159 centimeters, one very, very small population. In Japan, if you go back to the kind of what would be the classical era in Europe, that's 300 BC to 250 AD. There's some skeletal evidence that survived from that period. What's the average height of males in that sample? It's 161 centimeters. It's also extremely small, but it's just as tall as the Japanese are by the 1880s. There's another group of evidence that comes from the Edo period or the Tokugawa period from 1603 to 1867. Male Japanese in that period come in at 158 centimeters. And so the same fact shows up for Japan. There's no sign of any trend in the skeletal evidence. The Japanese 2,000 years before the 1880s are the same height as they are in the 1880s. They're all extremely small, right? But you can see there that that's nice evidence because it's saying that there's just no sign that living standards in any sense have improved in Japan over this period. And as I say, these measurements come out at being, as I say, remarkably small for some reason in the case of Japanese. The other place that we get early evidence from is Polynesia, right? And remember, in Polynesia, there is no written record before the arrival of Europeans, right? This was a pre-literate culture in terms of having written language. What's the evidence for Polynesian skeletons? Here we get some collections from 1400 to 1800. So this is at just before the time of European contact. And the average heights here come in to be amongst the biggest you see in the world. People are actually very tall in these skeletal collections in Polynesia, right? And remember, Japanese were coming in at about 158 centimeters, so 2.5 centimeters per inch. And so the average pre-contact Polynesian was something like almost 5 inches taller than the average pre-industrial Japanese person, right? And as I say, again, it raises this kind of puzzle: does everyone really have the same potential height? Because it suggests that if everyone does, it suggests that in Polynesia, this really was a paradise in the pre-industrial world, in the sense that living standards must have been very, very good, right? These people are bigger, as I say, than Western Europeans, right? And that's why when people like Captain Cook arrived in Polynesia, they're just very impressed by the stature and handsomeness of the local populations in these islands, okay? And so you really do see, as I say, there are these paradises, it seems, in the pre-industrial past. The last in the book records more examples, more detail. The last couple of things I'll mention is that we also do have some evidence from India, from Harappa, which is a very early city in northern India, 2000 to 1000 BC. People come in at 169 centimeters. That's bigger than the Indians who are actually becoming indentured servants and migrants in the 19th century. We also get evidence from ancient Egypt. The problem there, though, is that there's a selection bias in that people who get made into mummies tend to be the upper classes in this period. And they come in about 165 to 66 centimeters. But in terms of heights, the evidence is just very clear. There's no sign that as we approach the Industrial Revolution, people in any sense in the world are getting taller. There's no sign that people in 1800 were any better taller than hunter-gatherers. And there's also still evidence of a lot of variation, that there are some places where people are living well, there's other places where people are living very badly. Okay, in terms of living conditions, let me mention one other measure here, which is to look at consumption shares. And this, the background behind this is something, a technique in economics that's known as the Engel curve. Okay? And these curves turn out to be amongst the most stable relationships that you can find empirically in economics. And what an Engel curve consists of is it's just showing the relationship between income per person, real income, and consumption of any type of product you want to look at, right? So they can be drawn for wide categories of food, of products such as food versus shelter versus clothing. They can be drawn for any specific good you want to consider, okay? And there'll be a typical pattern of consumption as income varies in different goods, and it's going to be very different for different types of goods. And if we draw a straight line here, then what we'll find is that some goods, as income goes up, consumption rises more than proportionately. And those goods are called luxury goods in economics. And so they're goods where richer people consume proportionately much more of those goods than poor people. And so one way of measuring people's real income then is just to say, what does their consumption pattern look like, right? It's going to give us an indication, because of the stability of these curves, of what that's going to look like. There are other goods where as income rises, consumption rises much less than proportionately. Okay? And those are inferior goods. Okay? And those will be goods that typically poor people consume a much larger proportion of. Okay? And there are even some goods where, as income rises, consumption of the good will actually decline. Okay? Sorry, and that's an inferior good. And so that you get this range of consumption possibilities. So there's luxuries where proportionately you're spending more on the good as income goes up. There's another category, normal goods, where consumption rises, but it's declining as a share of your consumption possibilities. And there's a set of goods where, as income rises, consumption is actually declining, and so the share is actually declining very sharply. Okay? And one of the things I mentioned about that is that the stability of these relationships means that we can actually get pretty good predictions of what the future is going to look like, right? So that, you know, we know that as income rises, people's consumption of cars goes up, okay? And that cars essentially are a luxury good, and that, you know, as the world income is rising, it's going to be very hard to stop global warming, because there's going to be this very, very strong rising demand in places like India and China for things like cars. And again, we can look at energy consumption, and we know that energy consumption rises with income. It doesn't rise more than proportionately, right? And so that we can actually, and we can see also that food consumption also rises with income, but rises very slowly with income. And so that's why, as countries get richer and richer, the consumption basket switches away from food and towards services and manufactured goods, right? And that's why, for example, we know that agriculture, as countries develop, becomes a smaller and smaller sector of activity, because of the fact that the actual food expenditure in people's incomes falls to something like 3 or 4%, right? A lot of the cost of food is actually the cost of delivering it to the table and processing it and manufacturing it into the product that you call food. But you will actually get this decline in activity, okay? And so one of the ways then that we can go and say, is Japan really that much poorer than England in 1800, is just to take the consumption patterns of the Japanese and English and say, well, how do they compare, okay? And the poorest people spend almost all of their food, almost all of their budget is spent on just calorie consumption. It's the foods that most cheaply deliver calories. That's where the bulk of their consumption is going to be concentrated. And so when we do that comparison, we find that the Japanese in the 1750s, something like 95% of their consumption is for grains, right? That their consumption bundle is just very, very heavily weighted towards the most basic of foodstuffs, whereas in England, around about 1800, only 61% of the workers' consumption bundle is actually devoted to grain consumption. And that again says, well, the Japanese must be much poorer than the English, because the English have actually switched to more expensive forms of calories, right? That they've actually switched to these products that are characteristics of higher incomes. And then in comparison, we can look at, say, India in 1950, and their grain consumption for working families in India was about 83% of income. And so again, it's emphasizing that point that the pre-industrial English are better off than countries like India until very recently. It's only recently that a country like India actually was richer than people in pre-industrial England. And then the second pattern that we can show as the difference is that Japanese pre-industrial consumers consumed almost no meat, whereas there's significant amounts of consumption of meat even by poor households in England. And that, again, is just reflecting this fact that consumption standards are higher. And the other great thing about the high-income consumers is that in the pre-industrial world, alcohol is a luxury good, and that as people get richer, they consume enormous amounts of alcohol. It's hard for you to understand just how big alcohol consumption was in places like pre-industrial England. I have looked at the records of the Foundling Hospital in London, and one of their big consumption items for the orphans is alcohol. They actually serve beer to the 10-year-old orphans. It's just a standard item it's a weaker form of beer, but it's a standard item of consumption. Workers at work in the pre-industrial period would drink all the time while they're working. People like Dr. Johnson, when he went out for the evening, would easily consume 1 or 2 bottles of wine. It's very much imbued into the good life in the pre-industrial period. And in fact, in the Industrial Revolution period, there's a major sobering up that actually comes to the British population. And tea, the introduction of tea, was regarded as very positively as a way of trying to get rid of all of this alcohol consumption that's going on amongst the lower classes. And similarly, agricultural workers in England before 1800, in the harvest season in some parts of the country, it was typical for the employer to supply them with a gallon of beer during the workday, right? And so they would actually be just drinking all the way through in the good times of the year. And even in the bad times, in some areas of the country, it was the employer would supply several pints of beer a day to workers in this case. And so that, and in a place like Japan, in the pre-industrial period, there's apparently almost no alcohol consumption. And so again, that's just reflecting these differences in living standards. Alcohol is basically liquid bread, right, in this period, if you think about beer, right? It's made from barley, but it's a much more expensive way to consume these calories. And so only richer people can afford to actually get them in the form of of beer, as opposed to actually just getting them in the form of bread. And so again, this kind of backs the idea, rich Europe, relatively poor Asia, and also relatively high living standards in pre-industrial Europe, even compared to the modern world. The last thing in terms of material living conditions is work hours. I've already gone through that and talked about how hunter-gatherer society, forager society, often they're only working less than 6 hours a day, right? And that's, counting every type of work activity. Britain, on the eve of the Industrial Revolution, time diary studies there suggest 9 hours of work per day per male adult. Okay? And I'd say that's counting everything that we would think of as work, right? So I cleaned up our kitchen this morning. That's work, right? And so it's as much work as work that's paid for outside the house. One of the interesting things is that in modern censuses have collected time studies of people's activities. And so if we do a comparison, we can get data for England in the year 2000, right? And again, I've just taken males so that we have a comparable group. And the interesting thing is that if you look at actual paid work, you would think that one of the things that's happened as people get richer is that work declines, right? That we spend some of our income in the form of much more leisure. It turns out that looking at those time diaries, in the UK in the year 2000, the average male was actually working 8.8 hours a day, averaging over every day of the year. Because you've also got to add to the work you get paid for is time spent commuting, traveling to get to work, time spent on home repairs, time spent on cleaning up your house, time spent on, I think I counted childcare as well, though there's still not a lot that's done by men. When you add all of that in, the interesting evidence is that from the year 1800 to the year 2000, even though the income of English consumers increased by about 14-fold, they chose to spend all of that income on material goods. And they actually choose to spend very little of it in terms of higher leisure. And that, again, is one of the reasons why it's going to be very hard to stop forces like global warming. Because the evidence is that when we get richer, we want to consume more goods and services. We don't want to take that income in the form of leisure. It'd be easy to kind of to limit consumption of things like natural resources and oil and energy. If, as we got richer, we said, well, I just want to work 1 day a week now. The rest of the time, I want to write poetry. I want to sing songs. I want to walk barefoot in the trees, right? It turns out that interestingly, is a strange thing about people, is that we seem to be driven towards material consumption even beyond the point of any necessity, right? As we get richer, we're going to buy bigger and bigger houses. We're going to buy fancier cars, more cars. We're going to buy toys like Harley Davidsons and boats. I mean, we're just driven towards greater and greater material consumption. And again, we can observe that in cross-section. How much do rich people work in America compared to poor people? There's a selection bias there that, you know, people who want to work a lot are likely to end up higher in the income distribution. But the evidence again there is that richer people tend to just consume a lot of that income in the form of goods and services and not in the form of leisure. Okay? And that's one of the puzzles then, which is how come we became addicted to work, right? Hunter-gatherers are not addicted to work. They seem to like leisure. As we move towards modern industrial society, we are, in some sense, we're work addicts, right? We have to work, we need to work. We work and we accumulate all of these material possessions. And one of the interesting questions then about the Industrial Revolution is that in part a product of changing attitudes by people, right? Are we a cultural form where we've come to define ourselves by work activity, or did we change in some other way, and is that in part responsible for this onset of modern economic growth? And we'll see that when we look in the book that some people have thought that there are religious reasons why we switched in that way. Other people have thought that what's actually happened was that a new world of consumption possibilities appeared, that hunter-gatherers had such limited consumption possibilities that they ran out of things to consume very quickly. But that what happened in, for example, Western Europe is that suddenly a whole new set of things appeared that people could now want, and that changed that equation between work and leisure and led to a lot of modern growth. Okay, and we'll come back and talk about these issues. So that's it in terms of material living standards. And as I say, to emphasize the message here, the message is no evidence of any progress till 1800. Big differences, though, across the world in 1800 between Europe and Asia. Now, this conclusion, as I mentioned, is highly controversial and would be accepted by very few of my fellow economic historians. And so the question is, what is it that they look to that says that this can't be right? Why do they think that before the Industrial Revolution, there's actually a long period of slow growth in material living standards that then is followed by this more rapid period in the modern world? And one of the things that people actually point to is the phenomena of urbanization. And it turns out urbanization, again, is connected through the Engel curve to measures of real income. Because as I say, one of the most stable relationships we find is that as people get richer, they spend a smaller and smaller proportion of their income on food. And so one way of measuring living standards then is to say, well, how much do you have to spend on food and how much is left over for other things? Now, what happens as people's consumption of food declines? Well, food is produced in the agricultural sector in the economy, the raw materials for food. And consequently, as societies get richer and richer, agriculture is a declining share of employment. That's why the University of California, Davis, which has this important ag school, is in some sense very poorly positioned in terms of where the modern economy is going. I mean, it's time to say goodbye to the ag school because agriculture now is much less important as a share of economic activity in America than most things. Most of the rest of the economy, retailing, the financial sector, these are all much bigger as a share of the economy than agriculture. And so as societies get richer, agriculture declines as a share of production, and they become non-agricultural. And one of the things that happens in non-agricultural societies is that people then consolidate in cities. In agricultural societies, you're forced to live out in the fields. And so you're forced to have this dispersed population. But as soon as agriculture becomes a less important activity, people start to consolidate in cities. And so now countries like the United States are highly urbanized. And so if we look across the modern world, there's quite a good and stable relationship between urbanization rates and income levels. And so one of the things that people who believe that there's a lot of growth before the Industrial Revolution would point to is to say, in the poorest societies, urbanization rates can be as low as 2 or 3% of the population that actually lives in cities. In England, by 1800, 30% of the population was actually living in cities. If you go to the Netherlands again, 30 or 40% of the population is living in cities in the eve of the Industrial Revolution. That must imply that these were consequently much richer societies than the average society in the past. And that's why, if we look at that urbanization evidence, we'd have to say that urbanization had been increasing in places like Europe over the period leading up to the Industrial Revolution. It must be that Europeans somehow were getting much richer, and it must be that these other measures are just failing to capture how wealthy people are becoming in these societies. Why is that, I don't think, particularly convincing? Well, the problem is that in somewhere like England, we have very good measures of day wages or of annual incomes in the society. I mean, these measures are very, very good. If you go back to 1450, we know that the incomes then are higher than they are in Britain in the 1860s, when almost more than half the population is living in cities. In that period in England, there are very, very few towns and cities. Population is very small in urban areas, right? Less than 10% of the population is actually living in cities, right? And so we actually know for England that for some reason, that relationship doesn't work very well in the pre-industrial world, that you can have very rich societies that are still largely rural societies. It's a bit of a mystery why in those societies where we think a lot of activity is not going to be in agriculture, because they're so rich, they must be spending a lot of their income on stuff other than food. Why are they all still out in the countryside in a place like that in the pre-industrial era, right? One possibility is it's because cities are so dangerous as places to live in the pre-industrial era, that people are actually aware of that. And what's happening is that they choose to remain in the countryside because of the health benefits of living in rural areas. And what actually happens is that after 1800, there are very rapid improvements in hygiene in places like London. Cities quickly become not much less dangerous, or they're still worse than the countryside, but the disadvantage of living in cities declines. And so it may be that that's actually what's keeping people out of cities in earlier periods. But it is, as I say, one of the mysteries of this story is if incomes really didn't increase in this pre-industrial period, why then are so many people in Western Europe already concentrated in cities? And why is the urban share of the population increasing quite significantly between 1400 and 1800 if our real wage data suggests that there really isn't much wage increase? And as I say, all I can say is that we know England, we know wages, we know living standards there, and we know that you can actually have very rich societies that are not urbanized, right? And in the case of hunter-gatherers, their production technology means that they can never be urbanized, right? So that's why they have to live in that particular way. But this is really a comparison across settled agrarian societies, which is to say, well, you know, if England is not any richer than England in 1200, why so many people concentrated in the cities? We'll come back maybe and talk about that a little bit later. Okay, so that's the first thing we want to look at in the pre-industrial period, which is material living standards. The next thing that I wanted to then discuss is, well, what about fertility? We see that living standards are very high in Northwest Europe. Why is it that they're so high? Now, even at the time of Malthus in the later editions of his Principles argues that living standards are being maintained at high levels in Western Europe by restraints on fertility. And until recently, until within the last 10 or 20 years, historical demographers actually thought that Europe was a relatively unique society in the pre-industrial period, that it had achieved high levels of fertility control, and that's why living standards were high in pre-industrial Europe. And that also seemed to fit in with this idea that leading up to the Industrial Revolution in Europe was an increase in self-control, awareness, attempts at rational control of your life possibilities in somewhere like Europe. That Europe was different from these fatalistic societies like India or China, where fertility seemed to be relatively uncontrolled, and that Europe was showing already, hundreds of years before the Industrial Revolution, important changes in social structure and also in kind of individual thought and individual rationality, right? And so this look at fertility then, one of the interesting things about this is that's the one thing we know that people could do in the pre-industrial world to raise living standards. It would be very interesting if Europeans somehow figured out how to do this, but other parts of the world hadn't, and that explained high European incomes. What's happened since then, though, is that, and I'll show you this, as we've learned more and more in the last 20 years about fertility behavior in Japan, in China, and also in hunter-gatherer societies, what you actually discover is that those societies actually look like ones where there's some kind of conscious attempt to control fertility, and Europe looks like a society where fertility is controlled by bizarre and kind of accidental means. And it actually looks like Asia is the place which has a much more modern pattern of control of fertility, and that there's as much fertility control in Asia as there is in Europe in the pre-industrial period, and that fertility is not going to explain why living standards are so high in the pre-industrial world in Europe. Now, in looking at fertility, let's start and look at Northwest Europe. And the first thing that I'm going to put up here is a table where we have the age ranges of women, and then I'm going to show you data for a group called the Hutterites. And the Hutterites are a very valuable demographic source. They're a German sect, followers of an original writer called Hutter, who are pacifists and have strong religious, fundamentalist Protestant views. And their pacifism led them to being persecuted in Europe in various places because they refused to serve in armies. And then they eventually settled in Canada and in the upper Midwest in the United States. And in the early part of the 20th century, this group married young, almost all women married, and they practiced, as far as we can tell, no fertility control. And so they actually formed the kind of baseline measure of how high human fertility can be if it really is unregulated. In modern times, the Hutterites have also had significant declines in their fertility. But as I say, in the early 20th century, before 1950, they formed this nice source, and they're well documented. And also, it's a very healthy and clean living population. And so it shows you under the best conditions what would kind of unregulated fertility look like in human populations. And so we're going to divide people up by age ranges. these are 5-year age ranges. And what we're going to show is, well, what's the birth rate for married women in Hutterite communities at these different age ranges? And so you'll see that this is 0.55. That means that there's 0.55 births per woman per year in this community. And so at this age, roughly there's a birth every 2 years. Okay? And that's about as high as it can get under natural conditions, because breastfeeding helps to delay subsequent pregnancies. And also, not all conceptions return in a baby that goes to term. And so there's a lot of fetuses that miscarry. And so that this tells us kind of, this is the upper level of what natural fertility can look like. And what you also see is that those fertility levels decline steadily with age. And so by the time women are 40 to 44, they're typically giving birth to a child only once every 5 years. Okay? And so you can see that there's that, and actually if we took the 15 to 19, I think their fertility might be even higher than this level here. Okay? And so there's this steady decline just in female fertility with age. And that's actually has important social consequences that in modern America, because it's not terribly well perceived, I think, by people that there is this decline in natural fertility. And there's been a very strong tendency for women to delay fertility until well into their 30s in modern societies. And then the problem comes up is that for a lot of people it can be quite hard to conceive. And so that's why we have, in part, this very, very highly paid fertility industry in the United States, which is that the pattern of modern careers just doesn't fit very well with the natural pattern of human fertility, right? And so that there's, as I say, we've developed a society where there's this important mismatch between the timing of when people want to have children and the timing of when conception is actually easy in our society. So that's the Hutterites. Now, if we take France in the years before 1800 and look at married women in France, what was their fertility pattern? Here's the birth rates of women in France. So what you see is that in a lot of pre-industrial Europe, the fertility of married women is very close to the Hutterite levels, right? It's never as high as these levels, but one of the things that's going to matter in terms of fertility is health, and Hutterite population is much healthier than populations from pre-industrial Europe. There's going to be untreated venereal disease. There's various other things that are going to limit fertility. There's also going to be health conditions that limit fertility in this period. And so what's impressive is in a country like France is that these fertility levels actually come fairly close, and they show the same kind of pattern of natural fertility. That is that fertility rates just decline steadily with age, and they're always somewhat less than these Hutterite levels, right? And it's not the case, for example, that you might see high levels and then after age 35, suddenly fertility drops very sharply, right? So you don't see any signs, obvious signs of control within marriage in Western Europe. One of the things, by the way, that keeps the French rates high, they're higher than the British rates within marriage in the pre-industrial period, is that in urban areas in France, they had a very odd practice. And one of the things you learn in studying history is that a lot of things we think are, oh, no society would ever do something like that. You find that people do, right? So, for example, we'll talk a little about fertility in Roman Egypt. One of the bizarre features of Roman Egypt is that a large fraction of marriages are between brothers and sisters. And it's something that sociobiologists would say, well, no society would do that. There's an inherent biological reason why you wouldn't do that. Not in Roman Egypt, so that, as I say, that's an odd feature. What's odd about French behavior in the cities in this period is that for wealthier families, middle-class families, it was very common in the 18th century at least for the child to be taken immediately from the mother and sent to the countryside to a wet nurse. And the child then would only return to the city and to the family if it survived till age 5. And it's, as I say, in our society, it's just very hard to imagine that people would say, oh yeah, take the kid away, see you in 5 years. What was your name? And it's, as I say, it's an odd pattern, but it is a standard pattern of France. And there were men whose specialty was ferrying kids out to the countryside, and they would actually have these panniers where they would have 4 or 5 kids strapped in there. And there's very little supervision out in the countryside. I mean, these people miles away from the city, and so wet nurses had an incentive to take on more kids than they could cope with, so that the death rates of these children are not, are quite high. Your best chances are typically going to be with your parents, right? We don't know, again, why people did this, right? It might have been they thought that the kids would be safer in the countryside, that the cities are very unhealthy. It's actually very little documented why this was the established pattern. But one of the effects that would have in a place like France is it would increase the birth rate. Because if you're not breastfeeding after a birth, it increases your subsequent fertility. And so what you're actually going to have is higher fertility rates in these societies if breastfeeding doesn't occur. And you can actually see in the record that if a child is born and then it dies quickly, that the spacing till the next child is shorter than if a child is born and it lives, right? Just from that fact of breastfeeding. And so the first thing then that we find in this data is that, interestingly, if Europeans were controlling their fertility, it's not within marriage that control is occurring. That within marriage, fertility rates tend to be very high. It actually varies across different places, but they tend to be very high within marriage. Now, demographers have so much data of the timing and spacing of births in pre-industrial Europe because in both England and France after 1540, parish registers were kept of all births and of all deaths. Sorry, and we were actually, since it's ecclesiastical records, it's actually of baptisms and of burials, right? But it's very close to births and deaths. And so from that, they can actually go and reconstruct families in villages in France and England for hundreds of years in the past and say, when did they marry? Who did they marry? What ages were they? What happened? When were the children born? What happened to the children in these families? And so we have pretty good records. And so demographers have actually tried to figure out, is there any sign of any kind of deliberate targeting of births within these families? And so one thing you can look at, for example, is suppose a family marries young and they're lucky and all of the children survive. So that when the woman gets to age 35, she has 8 surviving children. You would think that if people were going to control fertility, that then this would be a family that would say, probably got enough little Johns here now, time to limit fertility. There's no sign of any limitation as a result of that. When you look at the history of the family, at the numbers of surviving children that they have, at the ages at which women were married, you never can find in these European patterns before about 1800 any sign that within marriages people were trying to control fertility. It seems to be just unregulated within marriages, right? And it seems to be just that it's all the children that are born that come. And so what happens then is that Europe has a woman who was married in Europe from ages 20 to 44. Okay, and again, just to get our comparison, this would be a woman who was a Hutterite in the early 20th century, would give birth to 10.6 children. In France, in the pre-industrial period, it's estimated that such a woman would give birth to 9 children. Okay? And it ranges across Europe, and at the bottom end, we find, just put this back on. We actually find that in England, that number is only 7.6. Okay? So there is a range across Western European societies, so that the English produced less children than the French, right? But tests within England have shown pretty conclusively that that's nothing to do with any kind of conscious attempt to control fertility. It can be things like, recent French prime minister argued that the English just were sexually inhibited. And so it can be stuff to do with, the relative romanticness of the English versus the French. It can be to do with just practices about, when people have sex, when people don't have sex. But it doesn't seem to do with any conscious attempt to control fertility. Or it can be things like breastfeeding versus not breastfeeding across these different societies, okay? So when you look within marriage, as I say, there's just no control of fertility, and so in that sense, that's not where the action is in pre-industrial Europe. Why is fertility actually being kept relatively limited within these societies? And the answer here is because Europeans married in a very strange way in the pre-industrial period. But it turns out that it's a way that's very reminiscent of actual modern society. And so there's something called the European marriage pattern. And that consisted of three important elements. The first thing was late marriage. The average woman in pre-industrial Western Europe got married for the first time between ages 24 and 26. Now, since women become fertile around about age 16, what's actually happening then is that marriage is being delayed well through the fertile years in Western Europe. And this is very different. There's no other pre-industrial societies have this feature of this very long delay in marriage. And it's not only late, it actually moves up and down. So some periods it can be very high, or in some groups it can get to be very high, and in some periods it's lower, right? But there is this strange feature that marriage is actually delayed. The second thing is that few women, comparatively, in Western Europe actually get married. In any cohort of women, somewhere between 10 and 25% never marry. Okay? And then the third important feature is that there's little conception outside marriage. And so typically, only about 3 to 4% in the pre-industrial period of all births are to unmarried women. So basically, what's happening in European society is that a large fraction of fertile women are abstaining from sex. They're delaying getting married until ages 24 to 26, or they just never get married at all, and very few of them, outside marriage, seem to actually engage in sexual behavior, because there's very little evidence of use of fertility control in this society. And one of the puzzling things about this is it's not because Europeans had incredible prudishness about sex or really thought that it was a terrible thing outside marriage. A large fraction of these women who get married are actually pregnant at the time of their marriage. Once they've decided to get married, it's quite typical, and some of them are giving birth within 1 or 2 months of getting married. A large fraction of all births are within the first 9 months of marriage, right? And so once they decide to get married, then sex happens, right? But for some reason, there's just a long delay on average by women to get married. And so next time we're going to talk about, well, what is this doing? What are Europeans doing? And are they deliberately trying to control fertility in the pre-industrial world?